my name is Tony Dyer. I'm born and bred Bristolian, and I've been involved in politics for a while, but that's not why I'm here today. One of the other things I've always been interested in and written about is history, in particular Anglo-Saxon history, and also local and familiar history. But Anglo-Saxon history is a topic that I'm very interested in, largely because it tends to be neglected.
Well, yeah, it's in it the Dark Ages.
Yeah, that was the terminology it was used. It's very much frowned upon nowadays, and it's misleading because we do have a tremendous amount of information about the so-called Dark Ages, and particularly as we go into the later period of Anglo-Saxon. But even right from the beginning, there are plenty of evidence, both archaeological and also written evidence. It's just that some of it, or a lot of it, tends to have been ignored in the past.
So is that out of convenience? Do you think people were just thinking, well, actually, we would rather just sort of skip over this? And, is there any reasons why you think that there wasn't a proper engagement by historians?
I think twofold is a lot of it, historians, particularly into recently, tended to see themselves very separate from archaeologists, so they tended to rely on the written word. And for the early part of Anglo-Saxon history, the Anglo-Saxons were essentially illiterate, so there was not so many written records. Where those written records do exist, they tend to be on the Celtic side, if you like, in Wales and Old Wales, and they tended to be English-speaking historians tend to look down on the Welsh sources and not use them as much.
Well, look, let me try and place the Anglo-Saxon period, and do correct me if I'm wrong here. So we had a whole load of Iron Age hill forts, didn't we, before the Romans turned up. The Romans basically overran all those hill forts in around about 50 AD, and they stayed for until about 500, am I right? And that's when the Anglo-Saxon period officially sort of starts. Am I roughly right there?
You're roughly right. I mean, I think what we tend to do is we tend to look for easy dates to say this is when something ended and when something began. So what is normally seen is the Roman period is usually seen as the period from when the Romans invaded in AD 43 up until AD 410, which is supposedly when there was a letter sent by the Roman emperor to say, you're on your own, we can't do anything to help you anymore. And that's usually seen as the start of the Anglo-Saxon period.
Okay, so what happened? Did the Roman legions all withdraw from Britain, disband, or what?
Well, and this is kind of going back to having absolute dates, is that the legions had been withdrawn quite a while before. What had happened was that Britain had become the place where Roman emperors had started to be proclaimed by the soldiers. I mean, what happened with the decline of the Roman Empire is often wherever there was an army, they decided they had enough of the present emperor, and they would then choose a leader from amongst their own group and say, this is the new emperor. And then obviously that emperor would leave Britain and go and try and conquer the rest of the Roman Empire, taking his troops with him.
So looking back at Rome, what was it really that sort of led to the end of it? Or what was it? Was it just that there was not enough checks and balances on Roman power? I suppose that's how we think of it. I mean, we think of things like films like Caligula and, that sort of thing where they can just do what they want and there's no checks.
There was a certain element of that, but it's more a financial crash. Basically, the way the Roman system started work, people in certain areas who were wealthy didn't pay taxes. The people who did all the work got fed up doing all the work, and at the same time there was population pressures from outside. The Roman Empire needed more soldiers, and often because there wasn't enough of a population of Roman citizens itself, and many of them didn't want to be in the front line fighting.
Well, I can imagine actually if you were an Italian Roman soldier, one of the last places in the world you want to be posted up is up to Hadrian's Wall with the terrible weather and the awful winters and just having rocks and spears and things thrown at you.
This is true, although to be fair, for quite a long period, Italians had long ceased to be at the core of the Roman army. If anything, it was Spanish or North African troops tended to be, and Greeks as well. And quite an early quite a long time before the official end of the Roman period, you would have had what we now refer to as Angles and Saxons and Frisians in England, because they were brought in to be the troops that were guarding possibly Adrian's frontier, but also defending the southern shore of England against their own kind coming from over the North Sea who wanted to get into the Roman Empire.
How does Wales fit in? We're obviously quite close to Wales here. Were the Welsh all subdued by the Romans too?
The Welsh were never truly subdued. I mean, the reality is the Roman influences tend to be limited to the southeast of Britain. So you'd be looking at areas around London, around Cirencester, down towards the Mendip. So those areas tended to be Romanised. But even then, it tended to be an urban domination. Out in the country, there was much less Romanisation. So people probably carried on speaking whatever language they were speaking at the time. In fact, that's where we get the terminology pagans from, because the Roman territories were divided up, first of all, into civitates, which were large areas. So the one that covered our area covered Gloucestershire.
Like regions, basically.
Yeah, think of it as regional government. And then below that, they were divided up into what we might call counties, but they were called paesi or pagi, and they were seen as barbarians. The people in the countryside were the pagans, whereas the urban people were the Christians.
Okay, so we see the period after the Roman occupation as the Anglo-Saxon period. Who were the Angles? Who were the Saxons?
Okay, well, in Genoa, they were a whole host of people, usually speaking Germanic languages, and mostly coming from what is now Denmark and northern Germany. Some came from further afield.
Hang on, that's interesting, isn't it? Because Saxony is not northern Germany. You know, you think of surely the Saxons are supposed to come from Saxony, but they don't.
Well, they did at the time. I mean, what you had is large population movements. Saxony was originally the area of Saxons, but the Germanic peoples were facing expansion from the Slavs, and the Slavic people were caused by tribes further to the east, like the Huns and so on, expanding into their territories. So there was a lot of people under pressure looking for somewhere better to live where they themselves would be safe.
And so when can we say the Anglo-Saxon period starts then?
Depends what part of the country you're talking about. You probably can start talking about the Anglo-Saxon period beginning in the east. So in East Anglia, Kent, London area, quite early on, probably the 5th century and onwards.
So pretty much straight after the Romans?
Yeah, almost straight after you. But for our part of the country, Somerset, Gloucestershire and Somerset, Wiltshire, you're talking much later. Wiltshire would have been 6th century or so on. The first indications we have, putting King Arthur to one side for the moment, I'm sure that'll come up in a moment, but most people represent the Battle of Durham in AD 577 as being the period when the Saxons took over our part of the country, down to the River Avon, and then south of the river where I'm from still stayed Celtic.
Okay, so they were Celts. They were fighting. I mean, is this? I think we generally think of the Celts as having their own language, retaining their own language, being the Irish, the Welsh, the Gaelic languages, the Cornish language.
Yeah, I think Celts is a different. Is a controversial term to use, and it upsets a lot of people. I mean, there's the idea of that there are languages that are referred to as being Celtic nowadays. Whether that actually has any direct link with the Celtic culture that existed in Europe prior to the Roman expansion is up for debate. But what we had is probably the best way to describe them is Welsh as a language didn't exist, Cornish didn't exist. We had a Welsh series of British people, Britons, as opposed to Anglo-Saxons who spoke different languages or different dialects, but usually it's assumed that they spoke a version of languages that then later became Welsh and Cornish and Cumbric and so on.
But you're using the word Britain there. I mean, surely this is not just Wales, England. There's already some understanding of this being one country rather than, an amalgamation of lots of different. Where does the word come from? Do you know?
Britain. It's usually, it turns up quite early on in Roman circles, and before that in Greek and even Phoenician circles. There's a reference to the Britannic Isles with a P as being a major, these mystical islands that were on the edge of the word, and were very important because when the Bronze Age came along, copper was easier to find. But to create bronze, you needed tin, and there was only very few places that actually produced tin. One of those is Cornwall and West Devon, and that's where the Britannic Isles suddenly became a focus of attention because it had these natural resources.
Wow, it goes back a long, long way.
Long time.
Okay, so how do we get to the stage where we've got the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, that sort of thing?
Well, that's a story in itself. What happened over a period of time was you had different groups, and I think it's important to make the point that usually we assume that it was the Angles and the Saxons on one side and the Britons, the Celts, whatever you like to call them, on the other side. It wasn't. It was almost certainly much more complicated than that. So you often have different Anglo groups attacking different Saxon groups attacking other Saxon groups, and you also had the different Proto-Wales and Proto-Cornish. They were still didn't see themselves necessarily as one kingdom. In fact, there was almost never been a period when Wales was united until after it became dominated by the English.
At what point? I mean, because I'm imagining all these various factions raiding each other from time to time, but then you've got the Vikings too turning up.
The Vikings turned up in the 8th to 9th centuries. So by that time, your point earlier is valid. By that time, the Angles and Saxons and Frisians and Jutes and so on had coalesced into what was known as the Heptarchy, which is 7 separate kingdoms, of which the 3 main ones were Northumbria, Mercia and Wessex.
It does seem as if almost every time we manage to sort things out here in the British Isles that someone comes along and causes a load of trouble. In this case, it was the Vikings. But anyway, the Heptarchy, how did that come about? That and how did it work? Because obviously, if you're going to actually not be fighting each other, you need to have, even though you've got 7 different kingdoms, they need to have some sort of agreement.
Well, what tended to happen is you have alliances built up, and then depending often on who the leader was of a particular kingdom at the time, one of the states would become more powerful than the others. And he started to get recognition of somebody who was the overall ruler, or known as the Bretwalder. And then they were seen as being the primary king. That doesn't, which tended to mean that the other states, the other Anglo-Saxon states, would tend to do homage for them.
So what were the 7 Anglo-Saxon states?
The 7 Anglo-Saxon states were Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Essex, and one I've forgotten.
Okay. But so Scotland's not included in this?
No, although Scotland did have an Anglo-Saxon kingdom of its own, which was Dira or Bernicia. So long, the Anglo-Saxons have long been part of Scottish history and have been a major part of Scotland.
And Bristol, were we sandwiched between Mercia and Wessex? Or?
We would have... We don't really know when Bristol started and was created as a place, but where we are, where Bristol is now, it was on the border with the River Avon, almost certainly being the border between Mercia on the north of the river and Wessex on the south of the river. So essentially, when Gloucestershire and Somerset, that border basically carried on from Mercia and Wessex.
So with these 7 kingdoms, when did they coalesce and start to be organised as that, rather than, a bunch of warring factions?
Well, we can really thank the Vikings for that. It was the Vikings that kind of created, if you like, an existential threat to the Anglo-Saxons, and in the end forced them to unite in order to face down. Or through what really happened was the Vikings came in. They had new fighting techniques. They had freedom of movement. They could land anywhere they wanted, and also they were able to come here and attack farms. So most of the victories that the Vikings had were actually over local people. So you had essentially professional warriors against the local militia, which is why the Vikings found it so easy to win so many battles.
Did we have fleets of our own, or we just had
Not
nothing?
until much later, because there was never felt to be a need for them. We had trading ports that were trading overseas. Southampton was one of the earliest ones. So there was a trading, but there was never felt to be a need to have a proper navy of any
I mean,
type.
I'm surprised Bristol wasn't a trading port, because it is a kind of natural harbour, isn't it? And you've got the natural defences of the gorge here. It's quite perfect, really.
Yes, it would have been. It's difficult to know when Bristol... I mean, Bristol isn't really mentioned as a place name into the 11th century. Although it suddenly appears fully formed with a mint and so on, so it almost certainly existed before then. There is also some kind of circumstantial evidence to suggest that Bristol may have existed when the Vikings were around, and the reason why that is in Bristol, unlike almost everywhere else, the quay sides are referred to as backs, and there's a guy who's done looked at this and looked at the potential origin of the word, and the only origin you can find is a Norse word, which turns up in Icelandic literature and also in Norway as well, where backing means essentially a quay. So, and if you follow a route from Bristol to Ireland, which was a big, and to Dublin and the Irish slave ports, nearly all the navigational points actually have a Norse origin. So wherever Bristol became a place, it almost seems certain that Bristolians were taught to sail to Ireland, because it's always been Bristol's major trading port, by the Vikings.
Wow. What about faith, religion? Because, I would imagine with the Vikings being sort of quite fanatical in their, I think, Norse mythology and all that stuff, that may have had an influence. So had Christianity taken a hold on Britain at that point, or what?
By that point, Christianity had always, essentially, Roman Britain was a Christian, at least in the urban areas, it was a Christian province, and the Welsh were Christian. The Britons were Christian and stayed Christian all the way through it. The Anglo-Saxons came in with the same sort of mythology as the Vikings later came with. So you have Woden and Odin and Thor, and there are alternatives. It's essentially the same religion. So when the Vikings came in later, after the Anglo-Saxons were Christianised, it was almost like poacher turned gamekeeper to a sense, because it was the same type of warlike religion that drove the Anglo-Saxons 100 years before. When the Anglo-Saxons became Christianised, again, it depends on which part of the country. As a whole, the Pope sent over a mission in the beginning of the 7th century to convert the Anglo-Saxons, and it set up a diocese based in Canterbury, and then later another one was set up in York. Our part of the country was almost certainly already Christian. In fact, there was a strong possibility that our part of the country had quite a mixed Christian, Welsh, English, Saxon.
I know Glastonbury and Shaftesbury are both pretty early Christian settlements.
Shaftesbury became the western. The first cathedral set up in Wessex was at Winchester, and then Shaftesbury was later set up after the Saxons conquered Devon, Somerset and Devon, and they then set up a religious centre at Shaftesbury in Dorset.
OK, so what about the sort of denouement between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Vikings? Because I would imagine at some point the Anglo-Saxons said, right, well, we've had enough of this, let's really get organised.
Yeah, the person we have to thank most for that is King Alfred. And basically King Alfred managed to essentially militarised the entire country. A lot of people talk about Prussia and the German state of Prussia, about how militaristic that was, with what proportion of the population was involved in the army. that was nothing compared
Sounds
to
like Sparta or something.
Well, yeah, same. I mean, Anglo-Saxon England under Alfred, and Wessex in particular, was on a par with Sparta and Prussia. Everything was militarised. Every single man, and in some cases male children as well, had to give up time to go and serve in the local forces, and he also set up a standing army, and he set up a navy as well. And the system he came up with, he built a series of forts or burhs, essentially around the borders of Wessex and its allied Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
Which were what?
Burhs were essentially forts.
No, I mean which kingdoms were part of this burh system?
But by that time, the Vikings had completely taken over Northumbria, and they had pretty much conquered Mercia and East Anglia and Essex. So what was left was Wessex, which at that point essentially consisted of the land from Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Berkshire, Wiltshire, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight. And then also allied with that were, and by this time no longer really functioning as independent countries, were Sussex, Kent and Surrey.
OK, so these burhs, what were they?
They were essentially forts. They were forts. In many places, they were built large enough to shelter the local population, and then they were also given access to what was called a total number of hides of land, and each hide of land was enough land to be able to provide 2 people to protect the fort. And I said the reason why it was 2 people was because they did 6 months each and then swap over. So basically the idea was there would be there would be one person in the fort and one person harvesting the crops and looking after the cattle.
So hang on, one person in a fort can't do much, can they?
No, one person for every hide of land.
Oh, right.
So if you look at Bath, for instance, which was one of the burhs, Bath had 1,000 hides of land, so that provided 1,000 men to man the walls at each time, and then the length of the wall was calculated to be enough to be covered by 1,000 men. And by today's standards, we tend to think of 1,000 men as not being very many. But you have to remember that in Anglo-Saxon terminology, an army was anything more than 13 men. I mean, the armies were quite small. The Great Heathen Army, which was seen as being this massive army, was only a few hundred men.
Amazing. Did you think Alfred was borrowing some of his ideas from the Roman forts, maybe ruins of Roman forts, or where did he get his ideas from, do you think?
I think there was a number of sources for his ideas. One of them was an early Anglo-Saxon Mercian king called Offa, but also he took ideas from across the Channel, because one of the things the Vikings had obviously done was they turned up in their longships and they sailed up the river. So, for instance, we know that they sailed up the River Avon and then along the trim and set fire to Westbury Church, or what was then before as Westbury Church. So what they started to do was, as part of the burhs, was they put the burhs in positions where they had fortified bridges to actually stop the Vikings being able to sail up the river. And there is an argument that that's possibly maybe where Bristol started, was maybe they decided that Bath, because Bath was in Wessex, Alfred later took over control of Mercia through his children. That gave him access to Bristol. So maybe he then decided that it'd be better to move the burh from Bath up to Bristol. Maybe that's how Bristol got started.
Yeah, bring the fight to the Vikings. Well done, Alfred. You can understand it. How come he ended up out in the middle of nowhere in the levels then, burning cakes?
Because initially he was defeated. Essentially, he came very close to losing. If it had gone a slightly different way, he had been defeated by the Vikings. He lost quite a few battles. It took him a while to learn how to fight the Vikings at their own game. And essentially he was driven with just the remnants of his army into the marshes. And at the marshes, basically, marshes sound like quite a nice term, or the marshes. Essentially think of swamps. I mean, basically the whole of the Somerset Levers you could go in there and never come out again. You could lose entire caravans of goods in the marshes. Basically, he was able to get there, and then he was able to get support, round up men, and then they came out ready to fight, and then they started a series of battles, which then brought the Vikings. It was a Viking. They fought a battle near Chippenham, and they eventually defeated the Vikings of that time. The Vikings agreed to convert to Christianity, and then what Alfred did, which people sometimes forget, he then agreed to allow the Danes to stay in the lands, most of the lands that they had conquered, was East Anglia, and also what is now the East Midlands. And a line was drawn essentially down the middle of England, down the middle of the Pennines, across to Essex. On the west side, English law ruled. On the eastern side, Danish law.
The Dane law.
So you had the Dane law. And that's also where we got some of the East Midland towns like Leicester and Nottingham and so on.
So, at this point, surely this whole idea of having 7 kingdoms and having one... was it Brett Wilder, you said, who was the chief king of those 7 kingdoms? That must have broken down by the time.
Essentially, to all extent and purposes.
Especially if Mercia has been pretty much laid waste by the Vikings. After
that point in time, Mercia, for instance, only existed as a separate nation in name only. And a couple of generations later, Alfred's grandson essentially just told the ruler of the Mercia at the time, you're no longer a king, you're now an earl. And after that, it became earldoms. So you had the earldoms of Mercia and the earldom of Northumbria and the earldom of Wessex. And essentially, it was
so he demoted them in the feudal system, right?
Yeah, it said, well, because of the impact of the Vikings, they had ceased to be independent countries. They were no longer... they were dominated by the Danes. They were no longer able to protect themselves. And all his descendants did is make de facto what was already de jure. He made official what was already happening in practice, which was that Wessex was now England had Wessex had essentially conquered the west of England.
Okay, so this battle in Chippenham, when was it? And was that it? Was that the Vikings subdued and did they behave themselves?
No, in fact, well, for a while it maintained the peace.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about the late 9th century. So we're talking about coming into the 10th century. So we're talking about coming into a period where we're now more familiar with written history and so on. I've forgotten the exact date of the battle. I think it was 878 or something like that. But over that period of time, Alfred was late 9th century. After Alfred, essentially he's essentially seen as the founder of England as a country, although in reality it was only later, under Athelstan, that we actually saw England officially become a country on its own.
I mean, he was called the Great for all sorts of reasons, but one of the things he did was set up things like learning and libraries and that sort of thing, which is obviously quite important. I mean, we've had this battle in Bristol here over the libraries over the last few years, with the mayor amazingly claiming that he saved the libraries. I mean, we don't want to get too much into local politics, but anyway, he was quite into libraries, wasn't he, Alfred?
Alfred was, I mean, he's the only ruler of anywhere in the British Isles that has been given the epitaph, the Great. None of the others have been, Elizabeth or none of them have been called the Great. It's only Alfred. And you're right, it's not just because he essentially saved the idea of England, and I say the idea of England, but also because of the work he did in spreading literature, spreading learning. As a child, he made a pilgrimage to Rome. He was very religious. He helped set up and enable the church system, but also at that time, the church wasn't just about religion as we see it now. It was a whole series of things about setting a moral idea of how people should behave, and also he had the idea. He could have, a lesser king might have said, "Well, I've beaten the Vikings. I'm going to go on fighting them." Instead, he came to terms with them, and that took courage to do that. By coming to terms with the Danes, he actually turned the Danes in England into his allies. Having said that, there is always... You were
saying... I said, did they behave themselves? And you said no.
Well, there was always some conflict between the original Anglo-Saxon way of doing things and the Danish way of doing things. The Danes certainly had a lot more independence within their own territory than the equivalent English nobles did in their side. So there was always a level of independence. But also, one of the problems we were saying about Alfred having created England is that later on, the Danes actually conquered England. We had Canute and Sweyn Fortbeard actually conquered England and became kings of England. In fact, Canute set up a kingdom that covered from England, included parts of Ireland, Norway, Denmark. He created a great North Sea empire. And it was only into William the Conqueror, who himself was descended from the Vikings, who came along, and then we became a Norman state.
What about Arthur? Isn't he supposed to have been Anglo-Saxon? Did he ever really exist? Or was he sort of... this is a bit of a dispute about this, isn't there, as to whether he was a sort of creation of the Abbot of Glastonbury in order to try and get people to come down and do pilgrimages and that sort of thing. Well, what's the evidence for Arthur?
Well, there was definitely an historical person called Arthur, whether it's the same Arthur that we hear so much about. But there are... written histories that were quite close to the time of the period, which talk about Arthur in a way which implies that he was an historical figure. Where he was and whether there was more than one famous warrior called Arthur and whether he was a king is open up to debate, and we may never ever know the truth. My gut feeling is that there was somebody called Arthur who fought right at the beginning, fought some major battles against the invading Anglo-Saxons and probably stopped our part of the country in particular from falling into what happened in the east of England, where it became very Anglo-Saxon dominated.
I mean, your book is called Anglo-Saxon Democracy, but was it really democratic? Did it, was it just a monarchy, or do you think that there was a real kind of expression of the people's will through people like Alfred, or was it just as much as we could have expected at the time?
I think it was within the circumstances of the time. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. I mean, you had slavery, women had almost no rights whatsoever, and even within those people you were seen as free, how much you were worth depended on your status in life. And
this is the feudal system, isn't it? I mean, I suppose, unless you're right at the top of that feudal tree, you kind of got to behave yourself.
I think what and the reason why I wrote the book about Anglo-Saxon democracy was there was elements within the Anglo-Saxon period which, all through by today's standards, we think, oh, that's not democracy. But then you compare it to what happened after the Normans arrived, and you can see there was a lot more ability to have your say in what was happening. I mean, obviously, you can decide what the country's foreign policy was going to be, but at a local level...
Yeah, stop the Vikings.
Please stop the Vikings.
Yes, that was quite a popular
We won't vet it. But at a local level, what you had in Anglo-Saxon times is you had what was called a tithe, which was... Well, there was a tithing had different meanings at different times. There's also 1/10 of what you produce had to go to the church, but there was also a group of 10 who made decisions about what happened in the local area, and then 10 of those groups would then create something called 100, which would cover quite a wide area, and they would send representatives then to what became known as a shire moot, which would make decisions about the entire county, what we would call a county now, or a shire in those days. And they would have influence. I mean, they wouldn't be able to get away with saying whatever they wanted, but they could have some influence over the decisions that were
what
made.
about Anglo-Saxon basic things like health, education? Was there much?
There was a form of education, but the Anglo-Saxons, until Alfred, it started to change over Alfred, but before Alfred, the Anglo-Saxons weren't especially renowned for book learning, but they did like stories. And some of the great works of literature, we have Beowulf, although it's to do with things that happened in Scandinavia. It's essentially an English piece of work.
So was it mostly oral history then?
History,
so
mythology,
oral rather than written, or
yeah. In most cases, it would have been oral. It would have been, to be fair. I mean, a lot of people, you study Greek history and say about Homer's Odyssey, and they forget that was oral for almost 1,000 years. Homer's Odyssey was basically just the Odyssey was just a story that was written down, and it was only much later that Homer came along and said, I'll write this down. And now everybody says, Homer is a great writer. But it wasn't. He was just basically rewriting something that had been written a long time before.
What about things like basic life expectancy, the sort of things we would hope for today? Any ideas about what life was actually like in Anglo-Saxon times for ordinary folk?
Obviously, we've had great medical advances and so on. Anglo-Saxon, when the Vikings weren't burning down your village, Anglo-Saxon life, it was hard, it was brutal. You worked long hours, but at the same time, the water was safe to drink. Much later on, in medieval time, quite early, you would never drink the water. Everybody was drinking alcohol. I mean, basically, you drank beer because the water wasn't safe. And in Viking times, it deteriorated. But when we talk about the Viking period, and it's seen as this period of pillage and rape and so on, it's quite infrequent over the period of times. It's not like batters nowadays. You had long periods where life just carried on as normal. I
mean, around this area, are there any Anglo-Saxon remains much? There are a few Saxon churches and things, aren't there, dotted around?
There's churches with Anglo-Saxon origins. Probably, if you look at churches in the Bristol area, probably the church with the longest history I've always been within Bristol is St Peter's Church in Castle Park, but that's not the oldest church in what is now Bristol. You'll probably have to go up to Westbury is mentioned long before a church in Bristol is mentioned. And St John's in Bedminster is, unfortunately, there's nothing to be seen of it above ground. As a history, it dates back to well into the 8th century.
What about towns locally?
The Anglo-Saxons really didn't like towns, so what would tend to happen is if you look at the Roman towns that we know existed, they almost all went into decline because there wasn't the infrastructure set up, particularly in the early Anglo-Saxon period, to support people living in a town. It was essentially an agriculture.
You'd have to have someone bringing food in and that sort of thing, wouldn't you?
And also you have to have a reason. There was you didn't have a monetary system or anything like that. There was no need for that sort of stuff until later on. But if you were looking at Anglo-Saxon town, probably the best example of Anglo-Saxon towns would be if you look at Somerset, for instance. There are a number of towns which were known as warrior towns. They were basically the original warrior places that the king would go and visit when he came to Somerset, look around the Somerset area. And one of them, strange enough, is Bedminster, but unfortunately there's nothing Anglo-Saxon left in Bedminster. Okay. But you can go to places like Cheddar, Axbridge, Wales in Somerset is another example of Anglo-Saxon features down there.
When the Normans turned up, all this came to an end. I mean, is it legitimate, do you think, all the criticism of the Normans? There's been a lot of criticism, hasn't there, of the Doomsday Book and that sort of thing. What was that like, do you think, when the Normans arrived?
I think if you were one of the Anglo-Saxon nobles or an Anglo-Saxon cleric, then it was probably terrible for you. If you lived in the north of England and some areas like the Fens, for instance, where William Conqueror really went to town on them because they weren't doing what he wanted, then obviously it was terrible. I would hazard a guess that for the average individual, my ancestors, I would imagine they think it's pretty much the same as it was before. There's some guy with all the money and a big sword who's telling me to work hard and give him most of the stuff that I produce. So, and I think that's been the story for people of my family's background for as long as you can remember.
But the Domesday Book was something quite big, wasn't it? It was like different. And I know there were riots and stuff when we're talking about 1066, the Domesday Book 1086.
1086.
This is really people didn't like the idea that the central government, the king, was getting right into exactly what they were doing, and I suppose documenting everything that they were producing to make sure that they could be very efficiently taxed.
I think the people who were upset were almost certainly the people that owned the land.
The tax dodgers.
Yeah. To a certain extent. I mean, in a way, what the Domesday Book was about cataloguing what people had. Yeah.
An inventory, really.
An inventory of everything. And from a historian's point of view, it's brilliant because you go down and you get... we mentioned earlier about the Dark Ages. Often the reason why people talk about the Dark Ages is because the Domesday Book came along later. But it wasn't the first such attempt to make a catalogue of what people had. The church had been doing it in terms of getting tithings for quite a while. It wasn't as well documented, and it wasn't in... Well, the Domesday Book is actually two books. There was the one for Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. The eastern counties, which were the richest parts of the country, had a separate book. And then most of the rest of the country, like Somerset and Gloucestershire, were in the other book. And also, don't forget, there was parts of England that weren't part of England at the time, so they didn't get included.
Now, I've also heard that the Normans were actually over here before the Norman invasion, in an Anglo-Saxon period, the very late Anglo-Saxon period, supposedly helping the Anglo-Saxons with the, defences against the Welsh and all this sort of thing. So do you think that there was, to a certain extent, the Normans were looking around thinking, gosh, this is a nice place, whilst they were supposed to be helping the Anglo-Saxon rulers?
Well, don't forget the Normans themselves were descendants of Vikings that are settled in northern France in a deal they did with the French king, hence the name Normandy. There were also Normans were in England long. Edward the Confessor, for instance, had probably more Normans in his court and in important places than any previous Anglo-Saxon king. And also, we tend to look back of it as the Normans were the enemy, and were the Anglo-Saxons fighting to keep our country free. But there was quite a lot of Anglo-Saxons weren't really supportive of Howard Godwinson, who was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England.
So the thing is, when the Normans turned up, that's when, supposedly anyway, the medieval period starts, pretty much. What was the big difference? I mean, you've said for a lot of ordinary people it might have been no difference, but there must have been some kind of line.
There were differences in terms of, it was, in a lot of instances, historical rights were started to be taken away. Almost the entire religious governance was replaced by Normans. Obviously, the big difference was French now became the dominant language in everywhere where people were making decisions. And 1066 is an important date, and probably of all those dates that are just chosen to separate a period of time, then it does make sense for the Norman period rather than the medieval period to be dated from 1066. But there were also changes that came along in the 13th century, which is where we normally tend to think of the medieval period as starting, where England actually expanded and had massive growth and continued to grow and become a very wealthy country. And the Norman period is sort of like, in a way, sets that up, because they do make changes. Not all those changes are popular, but the Normans were a force of nature to a certain extent, because it wasn't only England. They also conquered Sicily. They were heavily involved in... obviously, later on, they started Ireland. They were fighting elsewhere in France, and they were basically... They were still Vikings. They wanted to go over and conquer them.
Well, they started a sort of big ecclesiastical building programme of things like abbeys, cathedrals after the Norman invasion. Well, not straight away after, but also castles as well, because I think people don't necessarily realise we didn't really have that sort of, those big stone-built defences up till the Normans.
Yeah, I would say the one key difference between... Because we were talking earlier about Saxon burhs, which was the Saxon equivalent of a castle, if you like. And you compare that to the Norman castle, and what somebody described it, I thought quite well to me, was that the idea of a Saxon burh was it was there to defend the town against foreign invasion, whereas often the idea of a Norman castle was to dominate the town. So it was kind of reversed, where the Saxon burh was there to protect you, the Norman castle was there to oppress you.
Fascinating. Anyway, Tony Dyer, author of Anglo-Saxon Democracy, published in 2010. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.